Rada, what's your weakest signal?
It's this bionic light activated stingray. It's basically this like 16 millimeter bionic stingray. So they basically took this thin gold skeleton that's sandwiched between two layers of stretchy polymer that's kind of supposed to simulate stingray skin. And then they took heart muscles that they harvested from rat embryos and then layered it onto the artificial vertebrae in a zigzag form. So it kind of creates this kinetic form almost. And they embedded these light activated proteins within that. So essentially when this thing becomes like fully formed, you can control it and like have it move through water by using light. Basically what happens is the algae that are embedded in the heart muscles that they've now attached to a vertebrae, they like expand and contract. And so it like propels this little thing along. Like we talk a lot about mobility on land, but there's so many issues with deep sea exploration and like finding vehicles that work underwater and that are agile and that are, you know, things like that. So like, I'm just curious about different forms of moving around and like different forms of like energy.
Is there a reason why they picked the stingray as the animal to
why can't it go as fast as a stingray? A stingray is fast.
The hypothesis that I have, because I was like trying to find information on like why, but the hypothesis I have is that it was probably a form that was not as complex as like a fish or some other kind of like marine animal where you could pick apart, and it's not like a squid where it's like all jelly-like, but it had enough mobility in it and like a simple enough vertebrae system to where you could actually augment that in some way and actually like design it in some way.
I mean, other than, you know, mobility underwater, they could also learn more about artificial hearts.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was like artificial organs even. They had to build 200 models of this thing to actually get it to the point where like the cells would fuse along the vertebrae in just the right sequencing to where when they moved it around with light, it didn't like jerk around and stuff like that. It was just like fluid kind of movement. So the light source is external and it's focused like a laser. And then this thing is like in the water. But that also then begs the question is like, how far down can this thing be below the surface to where like light doesn't hit it effectively anymore or something like that?
Do you guys hear of the space elevator project that a lot of people were talking about maybe like a decade ago or so? It was like laser powered because like how do you take all this fuel up to this thing and like that's, you know, potentially like, you know, thousands of meters above sea level or above the ground. And so they were talking about using a laser pointer, like a really, really strong laser to like power it. And so you're not actually carrying the energy source with you. You just emit that energy from the ground and then it captures and receives the energy and then actuates the energy to move up.
The question of like where the energy source is interesting because when you guys were talking about the stingray, why a stingray, I just realized its body plan is really weird for an animal because animals optimize essentially for roundness. You're trying to minimize surface area for like being attacked and being visible and all that stuff, whereas plants optimize for like a plane, like a flatness, maximum surface area. And the question of like how you get self-powered mobility might be with these like really flat, long sheets or something like that, you know, that are like powering themselves because they have to maximize the weight to surface area distribution. But I don't know if this stingray is powered by, I don't know what powers it actually.
Stings.
Yeah. It'd be cool if it was the algae. That'd be very cool. Because like getting a mobile thing that's powered by like photosynthesis is like a cool idea.
Yeah, so right now it's like proteins derived from algae that respond to light, blue light specifically. But like this is the interesting thing is like when I was at Arup, they had done this project in Hamburg where they had the entire facade had algae systems in it, and the algae was meant to kind of capture light and then produce energy for the building. And so this kind of felt like a smaller version of that and thinking a little bit more about algae as a power source. I've seen a lot around like harvesting plant energy to move things lately. Like stuff came out of like MIT lab a year ago or something like that. So I feel like there's something brewing where how can we use natural systems to power synthetic ones?
Isn't oil already natural though? It's like already just a bunch of trees.
Yeah, but that's like fuel versus like an energy mechanism, right?
Yeah.
Does algae move on its own? I don't know.
There's cyanobacteria. It doesn't count as, it's like a weird little category of its own. They used to think it was algae, but they realized lately that it's not algae. And it's actually a bacteria that has photosynthesis capability. So it's kind of a weird kingdom of its own.
Are those the things that like make bodies of water light up, or is that different?
It's the thing that caused the oxidation event 200 million years ago. But I don't know if it glows in the oceans.
Rada, what is the signal for you?
So it's a couple different things. One, it's thinking about new types of energy for mobility, honestly, in real life, which I know sounds crazy, but true. And then the other thing is like we talk a lot about new types of materials, but half the problem becomes, are they actually resilient in the environments that we need them in? And so like you can create like a concrete that's really good for a building, but then you put it into an actual building and then it doesn't necessarily work. So being able to kind of like test materials in new ways of, I don't know, new applications like a bionic stingray, something about nature and robotics, bionics.
Yeah, I like the rat heart piece. Sort of like, I think just putting these like biological organ systems and like biological like pumping mechanisms and like fluidics mechanisms into like the movement of our vehicles is a really cool idea. So I'm gonna go with signal for that part.
The image that people have about like what is bionic is so different, and oftentimes it moves to like, oh, like I'm going to be this exoskeleton human form thing. But when we talk about bionic, it doesn't have to be like an entire appendage or like an entire skeletal system. It could be we have taken the heart cells of a rat embryo and attached it to a piece of metal and had that metal act in a different way, and like that in itself becomes bionic. And so I love the fact that this was kind of like pushing the bounds of what we mean by bionic and what we mean by living, you know. And I think it starts to bring up a lot of questions, because if you look at like what this thing looks like, it freakily looks like a real stingray. And like, how would I feel seeing that thing swimming around? It felt like almost like we were messing a little bit too much with life forms, but I liked the kind of sense of, I don't know, there was like a level of hubris in it.
I have a question. Do people know if people are working on cellular agriculture projects for like, not for their food benefits, but like mechanical properties, or for like these sorts of projects, which are like used for like actuation and sensing or things like that, and not for food?
There's a whole Ingrid Burrington article on like how to grow skin for all the cyborgs that are going to be popping up in the next like 50 years. How do you grow enough skin to cover all these robots?
But also like not just covering robots, like covering buildings, covering cars. So it's like bionic infrastructure.
Yeah. The thing about any material that uses that kind of like a protein as its base is that it's going to like stink when it like rots and stuff. It's just going to be like a putrid like garbage dump, you know?
Putrid features.
Yeah, like you'll have to bury a building the way you have to bury a body or burn it or whatever, you know?
But maybe that creates like a nice kind of ritual and, you know, sanctity to your space.
It's not so far off from like what people are already thinking in construction. Like there was this startup that's basically creating a database of materials, and they're talking about like construction materials as a service. You basically tag like each and every material of a built project, and it gets loaned out to a project, and then like in the afterlife of that building, or once you raise that structure to the ground, those materials can then go on and kind of, up until they kind of hit the end point of their life cycle, can be used in something else, right? So like the way we talk about deconstructing projects versus like demolishing them, the way we think about the life cycle of a material versus the life cycle of a building, there's a lot of work in that space right now. And I don't know if like the answer to that is that it must be an organic architecture. You know, I think like we can still think about deconstruction in other ways.
Will deconstruction become decomposition when we have biological architecture?
It might make more sense, actually. That's kind of interesting. Given like all the challenges of deconstruction.
Compostable cities.
There was that MoMA PS1 project, right, that the Living did, where it was like mushroom bricks, and then when the structure was done, they basically just like disintegrated the bricks back down to organic matter that they could then either like put into the ground or like remake into some kind of brick form, or burn.
I like the idea that we could like throw out our old robot device like into compost, or like you know, with the like food waste or something.
Yeah.
Like put it in your garden.
It's like, I like this idea of like thinking of the term bionic as something that could be organic. Yeah.
But don't forget to gut it and grab that gold skeleton first.
Pawn it off to the highest bidder. Yeah.
The question of whether it's alive too, like to me, it just feels like that tradition of like everything from like Mechanical Turk to Frankenstein to whatever that simulates movement in some way, but like it can't reproduce, like it can't like alter its own genome or something to adapt to the environment the way like a plant or bacteria can. So
I don't know.
Well, if it could, then I would feel like, oh shit, like that's getting the edge of like what's alive. Like
Well, I mean, if you're growing cells, right?
What if the heart muscle cells?
You do something.
Yeah.
Like not really connecting it to a full organism or something, or what we think of as an organism.
It's interesting because
the cells can be infected. A lot can happen.
It's interesting because the DNA inside these cells, like normally when you have like a cell, right? Like the DNA inside of the cell has like some sort of notion of the whole, like what this structure looks like when it like forms. In these heart cells, you're having this like stingray, like hybrid Franken animal. the notion of the whole that's represented in this DNA inside the cells is not actually what it is in its embedded context, right? Which is a weird animal. That's not what it would become if you just let it grow normally.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. It's not so like there's this concept in architecture called like adaptive reuse, which people have been employing for ages and ages and ages. But there was this guy like Sam Mockbee with Rural Studio who famously would make, you know, like chapels out of like windshield screens from cars, or like walls out of like houses out of like car tires and stuff. But this idea of adaptive reuse for bionic systems, or for like living cells and living materials, organic materials, I think is also kind of interesting. It's like, just because it's a heart muscle, a heart cell, does not mean you have to have it operate as a heart, right? Or grow it as a heart. The reason they chose the heart muscle cells from rat embryos was because those cells lend themselves to being able to contract and expand really easily. And so they had like this embedded kind of kineticism already.
Cool. What did it signal noise?
I think it's a signal of like a broader biodigital convergence that we're seeing. I think I'm quite excited for that, actually, because I think we need some new, pardon the pun, new blood in the digital space.
New blood in the digital space. Yeah, Fabulous.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I would say the same. Some kind of weird biodigital, as it said, hybrids seems interesting and like on the radar and exciting and weird and dangerous and worth paying attention to.
Macy?
Same. Also, just, again, along the lines of thinking of organic materials for infrastructure and other things. And I'm also very interested in this decomposition versus deconstruction, or a hybrid of that, as new rituals.
For sure. Yeah. For me, it's like this, the biomechanical applications that are kind of curious and interesting to me, of actually using some of these biological systems to, as like infrastructure or something in a strange future. Sounds really cool. So I'll go signal. So broadcast from later.